The third aspect, and wonderful aspect of the fourth wave of modern missions, is the fact that I really believe for the first time in all of history, we have the opportunity to reach everyone, everywhere. Now, of course, that's always been the goal. Always been the goal is to reach all the different people of the earth and to share God's good news with them. But that really hasn't been possible until the modern age, and we'll talk about the things that have made that meaningful. But in the world we live in today, there are a lot of people in the world, that's true. In fact, I actually went onto a world clock the other day just to kind of up my understanding about how many people there are in the world. And all you got to do is Google, world population. They'll bring up some clocks that show the numbers. And we're heading towards 7.3 billion people in the world, 7.2 something at this point in time. Back in William Carey's day, he was the father of modern missions just a couple hundred years ago. There were only 731 million people in the world. So the world's actually grown 10 times in the last 200 years, which again is fairly unique to history. And 1/3 of them still need to hear the good news. 2/3 of the world have either heard the message, accepted Christ, or a Christian in either a name or an actual practice, over 2 billion. Another 2 billion or so have the opportunity to hear or have heard but made no commitment to Christ. But there are another 1/3 of the world that really have not been given an honest opportunity to hear about Christ and to make a decision to follow Him. And what has happened is that God is changing that through these massive people movements. In fact, we've mentioned how the whole South American continent, for example, was kind of a sleepy Catholic continent for a long period of time, and religious people, Roman Catholics. But in the last just 100 years, there were about 25, maybe 50,000 or so people that were born again in South America in 1900, for example. But today, just 100 years later, there's 100 million of them, from 50,000 to 100 million in just 100 years. Africa, from 3 million to over 300 million. Actually, below the Sahara Desert, if you try to draw a line here where the predominantly Muslim states are, from here on down in Africa today is over 50% Christian. Many of the islands of the South Pacific have been fully evangelized, are Christian nations. We talked about the revival in China and in a few other places. There just are incredible people movements happening. God, of course, still wants to revive America. We believe that. He wants to continue to revitalize Europe. The Iron Curtain fell 30 years ago, and that, of course, opened up many nations to the gospel as well. So there are many people movements taking place, and it kind of boils down to this. It's probably going to take a few hundreds of millions to reach the final 2 billion. And of that, as we have mentioned, China and India become fairly crucial from that standpoint, because actually over 1/2 of all the total unreached people in the world live in China, just by itself, in one nation, almost 1/2, and 1/3 live in India. Now, some of you are acquainted with this, but some of you may not, that some people have kind of drawn a big triangle around a part of the world. It's called the 1040 window. And it's about where my fingers are here. Goes across North Africa, all across Central Asia, China. It also includes Indonesia. Here it's between the 10th parallel and the 40th parallel, a large window-like area. That's where the vast majority of the unreached peoples of the world are. And of course, China is in that portion. India is in that portion. We estimate that there are roughly 10% of the Chinese population are now followers of Christ. And I heard stories just this week about quite a number of wonderful awakenings and things that are still taking place in China. The Chinese revival started in the rural areas, but now it's come to the cities. It's in both, in just major, major ways. And again, kind of the best estimates are 10% of China are followers of Christ. If you look in the book, or even if you Google how many Christians there are in India, most statistics say about 2.5%, but most people actually feel that's not even close to reality. It has partly to do with the way the government publishes statistics and certain kinds of things. I've been doing some reading on this, and there's one man who actually believes India is approaching almost 25% Christian in some way, shape, or form, Catholic and evangelical. Now that's stunning for the second biggest nation in the world. Even if it's not that, I say it's safe to say 10%. 10% of India is as well. And so when we talk about, just what God's wanting to do to complete the task, we're talking about, 100 million here and 100 million here, and then other millions. You put it together and you truly have finally a spiritual army that can reach the earth. That could not have happened 200 years ago. It certainly couldn't have happened 500 years ago, and especially 1,000 years ago. There's just so many people coming to Christ in parts of the world, and even though the world's grown bigger and there are many more people, the ability to travel and many other things which allow us to go everywhere has made the world reachable for really the first time in history. Some examples of this are, there's a global movement today called the Call to All, C-A-L-L, the number 2, A-L-L. The Call to All, which is a kind of all the missionary organizations of the world coming together and saying, we can do it. Let's adopt the final people groups, let's target, let's go. For the first time in history, there are also dozens of plans for world evangelization, some of them emanating out of Latin America, Africa, Asia, again, for the very first time in history. If you want to check on your computer, just kind of punch in this little thing, Project 4K. Project 4K. It's actually a thing led by our organization where some of our strategic thinkers have divided the world into 4,000 what we call omega zones. 4K means 4,000. So the idea is looking at the population centers of the world and dividing up the world in little zones by way of population. You can divide the whole world into about 4,000 population-wise equal zones that allow you to kind of look right at the world. And of course, you can pull up Google Earth and decide, which omega zone am I going to take or am I going to pray for? Well, let's say I have an interest in Indonesia or whatever. I can go to 4K and punch it in and go to Google Earth and zero in and come down to a portion of a city where there's an X amount of people, and I can pray and I can learn, I can study and give a time and attention both in prayer and for missionary groups going to share the gospel there. It's again just an amazing thing. The best unreached people group site probably on the internet is called the Joshua Project, and they list all kinds of things related to, again, our ability to reach the world. And today, whereas 100 years ago there were probably less than 50 of these, today there are 4,000 majority world, Latin America, Africa, Asia, sending agencies, meaning missionary groups that once existed only here and here, but now there's a ton of them here and here and here and here and here. 4,000 different missionary groups that are making their plans to, again, try to do their part to reach the world. All of that really says we live in a time period where every single person can be reached. Some ways to personally apply this would be, first of all, of course, to pray. Every Christian can be missional in terms of praying for the world. In fact, 1 Timothy 2:1 says, we are to pray for all people. I wonder how many of us actually pray that prayer and think about 7.3 billion. But we're called to do it, and we can do it. In Matthew 9, verse 38, and we're to pray for laborers to go out into the harvest fields as well. So prayer is where we start. And this book, Operation World, is actually, more than anything, it's meant to be a prayer guide to help you pray for the entire world. That's my second point here. Read and pray your way through Operation World. If you really want to become an international Christian or a global Christian, one with a global viewpoint, you got to soak yourself in just the truth about the world. So either go online or pick up a book like Operation World. I did that a number of years ago. This is my third or fourth copy of it. I've got a couple of them that are duct taped because I just used them for a number of years. That's the only way I became acquainted with the world, was by just reading it and praying my way through the book, and it just really opened all kinds of horizons for me. Again, I met with a pastor this morning who actually lived in China for about 14 years. And he mentioned a number of the provinces of China where he'd lived and things he'd done. And only because I'd read Operation World, I knew where all those provinces were, because I'd prayed for him before. I'd also been to a few of them too, but just again reminded me the only way we can have a heart for these things is if we become acquainted with them by reading and praying. Number 3 is, of course, to get your church, your youth group, or your small group to adopt an unreached people group. We call that a UPG. Every single church in the world can do this, especially in the West, especially in the Americas, especially in Europe. And what a lifeblood it would bring if every single kind of European or American church decided, there are these 14,000 people groups, and among them about 2,000 of them are of greater priority that have never been reached. And actually the numbers are, of that 2,000, there are about 600 that are small groups that nobody is targeting. So if every single church, or even a small group in the church, or the youth group in the church decided they're going to make one of their focuses, learning about this people, praying for this people, sending teams to be with this people, finding missionaries and supporting them there, and on and on and on and on. What vitality that would bring into every church, global vision, and of course it would be a part of finishing the task. To get even more specific, we can personally adopt an unreached people group. That's one thing I did about 15 years ago. I just felt God, for a variety of reasons, lay upon my heart the nation of Mongolia. At the time, I knew nothing about Mongolia. For example, when I was a kid, Mongolia was called in the history books Outer Mongolia. Some of you might remember that. I didn't even know why that was true. But I realized in studying and finally traveling there over about 15 years that after World War II, when the powers of the world had divided up the globe, basically when the spoils for Russia in World War II, Russia took part, but China actually in this case, Russia took part of the north of Mongolia, but China actually absorbed 2/3 of the Mongolian people. And they're now Chinese provinces, which we call Inner Mongolia. 2/3 of the Mongol people live right here in northern China. They were just 50 years ago, 60 years ago, they were part of Mongolia. So that became Inner Mongolia. So when I was a kid, this is Outer Mongolia. Well, 15 years ago, I started traveling to Mongolia. In 1980, there wasn't one Christian in Mongolia, 0 in 1980. Today, there's over 150,000. There's probably 400 churches. God is doing a lot of really amazing things there in a very difficult environment. And I felt that's a nation that I'm going to personally adopt. And I go to many other places too because I am a missionary, but I have a particular interest in this little 4 million person nation that used to be the land of Genghis Khan, that had no believers 30 years ago. Now there's many others, and I'm doing many projects. I'm just doing what I can do to be a part of seeing them become a part of fulfilling the Great Commission. And how about you? I believe every single Christian can, over a lifetime, narrow in on, what's my people group? Maybe it's a number of them, but maybe it's just one. I believe every single Christian can be missional by, at the very least, praying for a people group and then getting involved as God shows them to. And then the final point would be, make a significant portion of your life, being missional. It's kind of the idea that we all have responsibilities we have to do. We have to put bread on the table. We got to pay the bills. We have a family. We have this. We have that. A lot of us have jobs and callings and vocations and all that. But in our lives, we have many compartments, don't we? We have hobbies. We have entertainment. We have this. We have that. There's all kinds of things. Well, why not make a significant compartment of your life in which you're not having to put bread on the table? Make that the focus upon an unreached people, a part of the world. Being missional, being intentional. So there are many things we can do. And for the first time in history, if we multiply this all together, if millions and hundreds of millions of people will begin praying for the unreached peoples of the nation, of the world, adopting them, getting their churches to adopt them in a relatively short amount of time. In fact, I heard a kind of renowned mission leader say not long ago that he felt that the world could be truly evangelized in the next 10 years if the church simply obeyed and did what they were supposed to do. That could never have been said in any other time period except this one. And that's the privilege of being alive today.